Well, good afternoon, folks, and thanks for joining us. My name is Joe Levy, and I'm CEO and founder of Uplevel. We're an engineering effectiveness platform, and one of the things we love to do is talk with engineering leaders about their thoughts and opinions on this growing market around running productive engineering teams at scale. And today we have the great honor of being joined by Steve Morin from Asana. And so we're going to have a little conversation about some trends that we see in the market and kind of get Steve's thoughts on it. Without further ado, I want to welcome Steve. And Steve, why don't you give us a little introduction? Tell us a bit about yourself, perhaps the work you're doing now, and what took you on a journey to get here.
Absolutely. Well, I'm a big pizza and bagel lover. I'm a New Yorker originally, a little bit of my background. I've been a 25-year career in software engineering, and some people describe themselves as career FANG people, or other people might describe themselves as a small startup person. And I've seen some people make good transitions from small to big. And I've bounced around in my career from being a founder and very small and big and back again a few times. So I keep it fresh and perspective on both sides of the coin. And I just love technology. I love product and the challenges, and there's different ones at different sizes. So part of the reason I keep changing it up over the course of my career.
I'll ask, I think, the question that I would think most people's on mind, which one's more fun, big or small?
Different challenges, and the pain changes on each side. That's the reality of it.
Right. That's a politically correct answer. That's probably the right way to answer that. Yeah, for sure, different challenges.
I've had another friend describe it this way. He describes it as he goes to the larger companies for vacations between startups.
Right. That's probably a good joke. I rarely think the big companies are vacations, but it just feels different somehow when the machine's rolling at a high thing. But yeah, I think the work's intense in just a different way.
It's completely true. I think that's part of the joke, is that the type of problems you get, and sometimes some people feel like the big company problems are simpler than the little company problems.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I thought we'd focus today's conversation on the topic that really is on everyone's mind, is around AI tools. And we hear this all the time, and I know you've had lots of good thoughts around this. And I just thought I'd just jump right in around how AI tools, you see them actually being adopted in the most practical manners. And just to be a bit more specific in my question, we see enablement broadly. I mean, it's great that people are getting licenses and turning these things on, but how do you see organizations actually setting developers up for success with these? Are there specific use cases you think that are working better? Are there different kinds of scenarios or different types of teams that embrace it better? Let's talk about where it really works and maybe where it doesn't.
It's been a fascinating interest of mine of like where these tools are actually working. And so I spend quite a bit of time like talking to friends and colleagues in different companies and trying to say, like, where do people have actual facts and not just feelings of how these things are being used? And the reality is, I think in many companies, what I see is lack of concerted effort. So I think it's hard to get real hard signal right now when people are like, sure, you can swipe the credit card, or my company XYZ bought a blanket purchase of various AI tools out of the market. And so you don't see programs putting in of what is the usage and adoption. A lot of the tools don't have observability in them. So you couldn't tell if you wanted to. This is just not mature enough yet. And you're left to be like, well, I want to make sure there's tools. So I think the way I think about it is two things. Like, I'm advising companies to figure out what is your training strategy, right? So just don't give tools to people, but have some people to try to form a center of excellence. Some people that know what they're doing, right? And really passionate and pay attention to it, right? And so those people are usually going to go deep, and then they can show people where to leverage it, right? You actually show people the tools so they actually adopt it. If you're going to pay, especially site-wide license for X number, hundreds of engineers, right? If you're a company at scale, you want to train people up to actually get the usage out of it. And otherwise, it might be sitting empty and you're just paying for empty seats. I think that goes for any tool, but I think there's an expectation that the AI tooling today cannot just make very specific use cases move faster, but people are trying to figure out, is it 5% or 20% lift? Which type of engineers is that coming from and why?
I'm going to push you a bit on the first thing you said. So center of excellence and sort of onboarding. Those words do sound great. And you made the joke yourself that they're a bit consultant-ish, and that's fine. Give me one or two use cases or training content or a way it's been rolled out that you've seen that feels particularly effective. Perhaps a type of team or a type of onboarding or something where you're like, yeah, that really enabled people to learn the prompts better or to enable their workflows better, or something happened better as a result of some enablement.
The one thing that comes to mind, it seems very easy and very tactical. And this is not boiling the ocean, but it's sort of like a go forward strategy, is two different groups, right? Broadly, when you have onboarding, a lot of companies at a certain scale, you have real deliberate onboarding training for your new engineers. Simple thing is you don't have to figure out how to train everyone else at the company, but you can start by everyone joining the company, right? That's a simple thing to do, right?
Right.
And it doesn't require a giant lift. And so a lot of times people have training modules in either the various technologies or like how to commit code and various core concepts for your software stack. So introducing it as another one of these modules and classes where we say, here's how you access the tools, here's the basics, right? To facilitate the behavioral pattern of using it. And then here's tips and tricks from our engineers of where we're using it. And it may be that you're like, we find great lifts in documentation, but maybe you're not finding it for test case generation. Why? Because maybe using a homegrown test case solution. And so it's just wasting people's time. It's not figuring it out, right? And this goes depending on the tool, right? Some tools are just emerging into understanding your actual code base, right? That's in its infancy, and there's some tools that have it, some that don't. I think every year as time goes by, you should have your developer efficiency teams for companies large enough to have them testing some new tools and being like, who's keeping up with like custom to my code base and who's not? I think that'll be the next big differentiator on a broad basis.
Oh, that's a big thought. That's clever. The first thing you said, I found quite interesting. Do you think there's a certain level of sophistication or maybe even domain of developer, first time out of college versus principal, something like that, that can adopt different use cases better of the AI? And I mean, would that change when it's documentation versus code writing versus test automation or something? Like, what combination do you think is getting the biggest value out of it today?
What I've seen, at least in some of the studies coming back, is code documentation's going up. Test cases, right? Those are two we're hearing just very commonly in industry. But I start to think, and I've been asking questions, are like, what value does my 15-year in senior engineer that's like a principal, do they get any value out of this tool, right? What is the new grad that is like just out of college, just out of grad school, just out of a boot camp? What value do they get? And I've talking to people, and this is by no means scientific, but talking to a number of people, it seems like there's a couple small trends, and I don't think this is exhaustive, but it seems like getting my new grad to go faster and not bug every little question to their onboarding buddy, at their company seems high leverage, right? And easy. It helps accelerate them. There's a second case, like I know I'm a rusty coder. I'm not coding every day, but I went to actually build some plugins. I've done a lot of JavaScript before all the modern JavaScript. So it's like quite dated. And going in and like language constructs, and I was putting together a small micro app. And for me as a very experienced coder, I've coded in 12 different languages over my career to varying degrees, some expert, some like barely anything. But like I know the concepts, and the time saved to not try to figure out what documentation page for JavaScript in the flavor that I'm working with Node and that version just accelerated me. And then I didn't just asking some basic things. I wasn't asking and I didn't realize the state of JS doc, for instance. And then it started filling out and teaching me basically, not that I asked, but showing me examples with like code patterns with JS doc. There was like way better code. And so then I'm like, oh, I'll do that too. My code got better just by following it. And I've seen instances where it might take me a week of putzing around to get up to speed with a lot of cruft on just scaffolding of a language that I just don't use very often. And I can do that in a day, right, as a senior engineer. And so I wonder in small use cases where like the experienced engineer, you're doing something new, it lets you like jump in faster. And I don't know if it would be valuable if you're like just onboarding to new platform for the long term or just in that transition period. But I've seen isolated cases like this where there are specific scenarios where people get more value out of it.
It's a really good point. I'll save some of this question for later, but I think what we see, we're about to release this whole study on this too, is there's so many activities that have to happen outside of just the PR push kind of motion, right? There are just this broad range of learning and finding the dependencies and understanding the documentation and going back and forth. And there's just a lot of stuff that has to happen outside of just raw coding time. I think there was a vision of like, oh, this thing will just write your code for you. And the much more practical application we keep hearing about is what you're describing, which is, hey, there's these other tasks, learning the dependencies, documenting things post fact, understanding the requirements a little better. They're just things that it can help you kind of get a kickstart on that feel like the better or easier to see use cases today. And I think that's what we see in our data as well.
Yeah. And I wonder who's going to get the broad niches right. I think there's two avenues. There's use case niches, right? And then there'll be like broad-based platform niches. And so looking at just the releases of the big players, you're like, part of my teams are mobile, so I have a vested interest in mobile. And I'm like, which solutions are doing for native iOS and native Android? Who's going to support the Flutter ecosystem, right? These are niche ecosystems, but if someone says a tooling, we're going to do this for this environment, we figured how to do this well. Like you'll get some people start to capture these other niche environments. I don't know if this is going to be the second, third string for the big FANG players that are building like dev tools, or this will end up being this is just 1 month away in their announcement plans, right? You just don't know, but people are waiting for the tools, right?
Yeah. It's such a great segue. It's a really interesting other factor of the use case. I think people think a lot about just seniority of the staff or tenure of the person and the type of task broadly. But let's talk about mobile for a minute. You have a deep background in this well before your current role and what you do today. So they are so different. I mean, it's not just iOS, Android platforms, which of course is the big one, but even just design elements and thinking about low connectivity. And there's just numerous things that a strong developer really has to consider in every way that the programs are written and deployed. Do you think AI's there yet? Do you think it is helping that niche in a way that really understands that domain? Or is it all just kind of full stack SaaS kind of focused stuff still?
I think it's skewed towards the volume, right? And I think it seems like a lot of the biggest players have been going towards the largest volume stacks, right? In today's day and age, it's like JavaScript and TypeScript is like what everyone's sees as a behemoth, right? There's still giant code bases in Java, but there's just less excitement there, right? Staying pretty steady slowly. I think some of the stats, like it's slowly like reducing, but like extremely slowly. So no surprise, people are going at the mass market. And I think if I was a startup, I'd be like, can I look at another very large population that is not the middle of the road, right? Because that's how I can defend myself against the Amazons, the GitHubs, the whomever else that are like, they have deeper pockets than me. There's like no doubt that, and they have amazing teams doing huge lifts. And if I was a startup today or advising one, I'd be like, hey, what other smart segments can you pick up that are being underserved?
Yeah.
At least as of today, publicly, there's some big veins that seem to be underserved.
Well, back to our joke, when you're at a big company, you only think about big opportunities. So these ones that are still big to a small company are different. Are you suggesting if you have a decent sized mobile team that leading tools today are just kind of not maybe up to snuff or as focused on that area as much? They're just not going to help you?
Yeah, I've been alluding to that, but like I've been keeping an eye out who's going to be the best of breed to support mobile. And in our world, my day to day, that's iOS native and Android native, right? And their ecosystems, right? In a perfect world, what we'd hope is Google and Android Studio would do great things. They have some support in what they've publicly launched. And you'd hope for something great from Apple for their developer ecosystem. And you have the beginnings of these things, but at least thus far, I love the interface work that GitHub has done. And now others are doing it, like Google's IDEs AI assistant has some of this, and they both have in common these chat interfaces that look at the context of the code. So you can highlight things and, have the focus without copy pasting into a separate chat window and things like this, and then different micro prompts. And I think that's a good first step. And I'm wondering like how much farther the aids of this technology from a usability, from a UI UX standpoint can really integrate into these IDEs. And I think anyone who's going for the developer use case will eventually get left behind by those that are like directly in the IDEs.
So connecting that back to what you said before, I think what you're saying is, sure, they can still help with maybe some documentation or perhaps other tasks, but they're not in the core flow. So eventually it just doesn't, whoever's in the core flow is going to win long term.
That's right. There's going to be a few things that probably make the difference. My guess would be being in the core flow, tuned to code bases with patterns, and whoever, like, not even just code bases, but starts to be able to tune things in like specific versions of libraries and things like that and do overlays. Whoever figures out like some sort of overlay technology to allow either quick fine tuning to versions and stuff like that is going to do better, right? And today it's about the giant corpuses and it does pretty good, but you know, I've definitely seen it hallucinate a few things and or just like not even hallucinate things 2 versions ago. And you're like, that is not helpful. And sometimes the 2 versions ago may work, but it's deprecated. 2 versions ago, even worse, is a security flaw, right? You don't even realize you're like going, it works. You're like, unit test passed, it works. And since you didn't do the normal flow of looking it up in the reference documentation where it put next to it deprecated, but like it worked, or you're like, oh, you didn't know. And so this starts to become a problem, right? That's why it becomes more critical when it's bypassing traditional documentation.
Yeah.
Which is a weird case. You like on a normal developer flow, you like hit your reference, you check it, and you'd be like, oh, okay.
Sure. The sort of double check of what's depreciated or not, if it's not flagged in the right way, is really tough one. What I hear you saying is, for anyone listening out there who's thinking about another startup and wants to think about AI tools in the IDE of a mobile world, Steve's your target customer.
I'm interested. There's so many going to be interested customers and like leaders that are looking ahead, because I don't know that anyone knows, like people are trying to estimate how much faster like you're making your dev teams. And I don't know if the real number is 5% or 20% or where it lives in between. But you just know that for probably a product that's going to cost $10 to $100, I'm getting that ROI back, even if I have non-San Francisco engineers, right? Because if they're really using it, you're net positive on your velocity, right? So it behooves engineering leaders to be arming their teams and testing out what's the best thing out there, right? Because if jumping from one tool to the next also gets you another 5% on top of that, why wouldn't you be like accelerating everyone?
Well, you just teed up a great next thread I wanted to sort of pull on a little bit here. So we obviously think a lot about the metrics, and you're talking about teams getting 5-10% better and how that's sort of approached. I'll tell you a trend I see, a recent article, and I think you and I have even talked about this. There are a tremendous amount of companies that are setting goals saying, make my engineering team 10% faster, and have not even defined what it is. It's sort of a goal for goal's sake. And then they're like, the team's scrambling. So how do you encourage a balance of metrics that is still understanding like business context? You want to always be driving improvement, but doesn't feel like it's just going to end in some sort of a gaming of, okay, you want more commits, I'll half all my work and double the volume of them. And Steve gets what he wants, and I haven't really added any value differently. What's your balance of ensuring people are working on the right things, working quickly, and how to measure that?
I think you need general guides, and I look at inputs and outputs, right? And what you can't control is the inputs that your teams are putting into things. But I don't overly metric, right? If you have your leaders talking to your engineers and setting up good goals, and you have some method, and I think there's a wide variety of things that works. There's not any one right answer, from you're in a sprint schedule or using Kanban, and you sort of have rough numbers, either in estimated story points or some other like eng hours to like specific epics, if you're going to go that route. And I think you need that baseline. But what I usually push back against on leaders is when you're tightly measuring everything and they're waking up every morning on observability dashboard to see every number of lines of codes and commits. And because no one wants to be treated from a human factor as a right, just like factory, how much you can produce. And then humans are not dumb. They will game it. Right. Yeah. And so I like to see some of those metrics in there when something is going wrong or really right. Because generally you hit sort of a baseline middle average when things are going, and you sort of track things and you use your regular project management. But then when maybe an engineer is struggling or something's going wrong, you use this to diagnose and sanity check things. And you're like, oh, maybe there is a specific person that needs help, that needs coaching. What's going on here? And then you can look at it to see where things are out of band. I was part of a large company a number of years ago, and I'll give you an example where like things can go sideways and people were looking metrics of engineers. And there was an engineer that was running all the data validation for like a major department. And they ran an important program and made sure the quality of the data and the metrics that are going out for the whole group to highly visible that mattered to both the business and Wall Street. And their code numbers were like, if you looked at all the traditional metrics, were near the floor. And, and then there was a few people in the room really calling out that this person needs to be put in a performance plan, and then it had to be a leader being like, do you know what this person does day to day?
Right.
Actually submitting PRs and committing code is not actually what we're having them do. They are a good engineer. And yes, we have standards, but they're ensure that everything's accurate, coordinating multiple teams and data reviews and data standards. And that's where I tell people, you got to look at the work people are really doing at the end of the day. Like anything else, metrics and tracking are tools. And as soon as you make that the end all be all, that if someone would have done that, that person would have been fired if someone didn't step in.
Crazy. I couldn't agree anymore. The way I've always thought about it, the context matters so much. And if you just rely on a number, it just does not tell the whole story. Let's pick that example because it's a great one. There are everyone, and I've heard this a lot, there is a sort of star 10Xer type who is working on something incredibly high profile and high visibility and of just paramount importance. But that thing is, one push a month or something, whatever it is, in a very small, in kind of the classic PR throughput type of metrics. The DORA framework would show it as a very low thing, but that does not equate to its value to the business. How do you bring that to light? How do you practically say, in some scalable manner, I have a bunch of people who are not writing tons of code, but what they are doing is this other work around it that's a little harder to see, but business critically important.
Again, setting context, and this is where sometimes like you redefine teams and the structures around the work, right? I think there are teams, for example, like often security teams, that people know the throughput on those security teams by the nature of the team. And that's one way you set it up. So if that team was mixed with a bunch of people, maybe half that were, for whatever reason, the type they're doing like in-application security fixes versus half that are doing like sort of process around it. This is where maybe you don't separate the teams, but you say, okay, I need to know who's like their number one focus is in the application security. We're going to look at that differently just for the general trend and recommendations. And I find that, like you mentioned earlier, the context is key, and setting people up for measurement success as they're being viewed in an organization is important. And so often aligning teams so you don't always have to remind people about the exception. So if you had a team and constantly you need to be the reminder to be like, no, there's one person singular on the team needs to do it. And then 5 other teams like don't that way. Like, I'm an advocate. If you left, is that person now in trouble and they're doing the right thing for the company? Right. So I like to say, do you need to invent a different role? If this is something long-term that someone needs to do, or do they need to be in a different team to protect them under change management if things happen? You get hit by a bus, won the lotto the next day and you're like, I'm going to hang on the beach. And then no one's
Yeah.
you're like, that person gets fired. This is a disaster for the company. Right.
Right.
That is also part of succession planning.
Yeah.
Right.
A big one I've seen there, and I'm curious your take on it, is I think so much of the problem goes into when you start doing absolute value comparisons as opposed to just trend of the person, right? I mean, if their average rate is something and that is explainable and right for that person, then that's probably okay. I mean, the big interest to me is always, did someone deviate a lot from their norm and why? Not as Sally all of a sudden faster than Jane specifically. It is a dangerous thing to use this sort of construct in that kind of measure.
Yeah. And often like take a look at them when something is different, right? All of
Yeah.
a sudden, someone who's doing great and there's a change, you say, hey, what's going on here? And it's gotten low. And then you can like, if you are the manager being like, that's unexpected or that is expected. If it is expected, you're like,
Right.
okay, no, I know the work was changing. If not, you're like, maybe I don't know enough about what's going on. And it may be a simple question. Oh, this is in a planning phase. I am actually out of sync as a manager. And because sometimes I find some junior, especially there's some people that really bias towards the numbers. I've seen some leaders at all levels. I do find a lot of newer managers sometimes can leverage it because quite frankly, looking at the numbers and the charts exclusively and like really dialing them in can actually just be lazy. You don't have the context. You're like, you don't need the context. Getting context is more work. Tracking what the work's going on and, who's doing what and what skills they have. And
I got to go talk to people. That's tiring. Yeah.
But the chart is easy. I can look at that chart in 2 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. No, the tools are dangerous in that way, right?
That's right. They can be abused, but all tools can be abused, right? It's just knowing the patterns of abuse.
I think that's exactly right. And it comes down to the abuse option has been there forever. So I think there's a more push to push things on numbers, which means the people who are responsible have a greater responsibility to handle that push appropriately, right?
Yes. And I saw a joke, like not in relation to like developers and stuff, but it was like, it's still a tech joke. And it was like a cartoon. And it was a cartoon with a graph in the background of a startup like tanking. And it was basically talking about being data driven. And they're like driving basically into the ground, being data driven. Right. And versus like someone else's has a map and has some instruments and data is data informed. Right. And I think, I felt like there's a big movement in industry when we had so much more observability tooling in product and in engineering. And we now had more things at scale. Big data was big 15 years ago with Hadoop and all these other things. Then people started saying like everything should be completely data driven. And I think some of them forgot that data does not always have the answer. Data didn't tell Henry Ford that people needed cars and not horses. They're make faster horses. Sort of the same trope that has been used 50,000 times. And this is about being data informed. And being data informed is more work and requires more critical thinking of what's actually appropriate.
That's so well said, Steve. And I think there's even a double in that, which is there's now a real onus on the leaders to use that data correctly and to apply the right context and to actually literally be using the math on it right. And like you said, looking for changes that are appropriate or not, but not just sort of average things. There was a great story I read quite a while ago about DoorDash early on. And people really doubted it would scale because it's almost like two Ubers that have to be perfectly coordinated. The food has to be picked up hot and delivered to you right at the right time. And I think they had a corporate value, and I might be getting this a bit wrong. I'm showing it a flag for it, but it was no averages. Who cares if our average delivery time is 38 minutes if Steve's meal took 1 hour 10? And so they got very diligent about everything has to be presented as a full bell curve and kind of presented as appropriate to what it is. But we can't just say there's an average because it hides all the goodness and opportunity and everything beneath it. And I see the same thing. What's our average cycle time across 2,000 developers? And I'm like, 3. I mean, who cares, right? Like it's a meaningless point. What you want to understand is teams appropriate based on what they work on. Are they improving in ways that are making sense for them? And the responsibility of this has really shifted a lot.
That's right. I think a lot of things is like old management applied to like new circumstance.
Right.
And because people were saying that with like plenty of tools before software management engineering teams, is like the Toyota factory line, they were saying that
Yeah.
for these things,
Yeah. Just in
not using
time.
the tools wrong and being like, hey, stop, let's fix the tools, right? I think this just keeps going. But the other thing that I think is a mistake is I think there's a lot of leaders that are not investing in understanding the technology. I knew I was getting behind. I ended up writing a white paper on AI because I was like, I'm not sure I understand how these things. I spent months putting together like a survey paper on AI, and every few years I've gone through this. When deep learning was big before the current LLM technology, I was like, I took 3 courses on it. I'm like, I need to be current and up to speed. And you don't need that for every role, like in engineering. But I get surprised even still for like people that are in big tech and they're like, this is not reading papers, mind you. I'm like, do you know what prompt engineering is? Do you know what few shot prompts are? I spent the time to learn underpinnings in mathematics and the change in mathematics to do deep learning and some of these other things. That's not what I'm advocating for folks and be like, oh, you're so behind because you didn't do deep mathematics. No, that is for deep interest or in deep need. But people are not learning that, oh, what is the cost of different types of inferencing? What is the base abilities of LLMs? What is the base limitations in a very business, high level centric way? How does this technology sort of high level work? You can have your like tech lead, that knows this stuff, sit down and being like, give me the 1 hour tutoring session. Why aren't you doing that? Right? Why are
Yeah.
you subscribing to a handful of newsletters to at least read the headlines and be like, all right, I'll absorb slowly the verbiage of what's going on with this technology trend? It's too big to ignore. And there's too many abuses of the magic this technology will do. And if you're not educated, especially as an engineering leader, you're supposed to call out where the limits are. And if you let a project go to la la land because it's going to deliver the heaven on earth, and then all of a sudden that project fails because it was never destined to succeed, right?
Right.
You have to be part of the grounding. You can say like, we don't know and we need to see how far we can do this, but then we should have some guardrails on this project. But if you don't have a basis of this technology and where some limits are, at least at a high level, you'll have no intuition of even what to challenge your teams on. And that's dangerous in my mind.
That is incredibly well said. Here's a closing thought. I'll try to bring a couple of points you said together on this. So we talked about the metrics and you talked about really the onus of leaders on these embracing AI in the right way. For an engineering leader out there who likely everyone has at some level, but is trying to articulate the value of putting Gen AI in their developers' hands, how would you expect just an average organization that probably has some mobile, some backend, I'll say a sort of an average smattering of skills? What metrics would you expect to see change and how? Are they going to have faster throughput? Are they going to improve the engagement scores of the developers? Is the quality going to go up? Like, what is a most reasonable guess that you think would happen?
It's a good question. My suspicion is the best tools are going to make the job less painful for the engineers, right? That's where you're going to have people get the most satisfaction. So it'll improve job satisfaction. It'll get rid of some of the pain, right? And you will get some velocity gains. It'll be holistically like a good benefit because people are going to use the tool in the ways that will increase their own job satisfaction. And I think that's big. I don't know what the patterns are yet that are like clearly winning, but I think most people would say like what we've seen in the early studies that have come out and a few of the big companies that put them out there is people are using generate documentation because they never wanted to be writing it to begin with.
Yeah.
Right. And so
Yeah.
that's a clear win. I think the coaching I would make sure is like, please don't generate it and not read it. Please, please just read the edit afterwards. Please,
Right.
like let it generate it, but then please read everyone just to make sure it's not hallucinating something.
Well, what's so fun in that, and we're about to release a study that overlays pretty well with some of that prediction. We think a lot about the developer experience and having a great story around that. And we do see it improving some of that, meaning in terms of like they're always on and not just kind of having to slave away all night catching up to stuff. But we also don't see a huge improvement in just things like raw cycle time, because I think it is more about the tasks around there. And so I agree with you. I think what's a funny world that could happen in the world you're describing is they're using it to generate the documentation and using AI to then read the documentation for the next person down the road, right? And so like the document is just sort of a holding place that no human is actually touching. But that's fine, right? I don't think that's actually wrong. I mean,
As long as it's been validated, as long as it's been checked in some way for accuracy, right? That
of
has
course.
to happen.
Yeah.
Or else you're in this like loop of no one knows what this code base does. Your documentation is not right. It was generated by
Yeah.
some AI, and then it's
And
being
then AI
referenced
read it
something
on the other
else.
side. Yeah. But if it takes you out of the loop, or I should say, if it generates that and then helps you on the reading side as well, and it can help you summarize it, and there's a check, that feels like a win on both on a job that is critically important and typically, I'll just say, frustrating for folks.
It's a win. And I think like something we haven't talked about today, but I think where like it doesn't get to, and I don't see things happening fast, is basically abstractions in code are there for human consumption, right? The classic number is people keep short-term working memory between 3 and 7 plus or minus, like some 2 or something very small, right? In your working memory. And why do we abstract things? Like they showed the studies in chess players, right? They're just able to abstract more moves in their mind. They have the same limited memory, but they're able to chunk more things in their memory through patterns and shapes. And senior engineers are basically sort of doing the same thing to their own domain, right? And so we have abstractions. And one thing we have not seen for the most part is, not that it doesn't use abstractions, because it copies abstractions out from everywhere else, but that's not a clear articulated architecture that will be adhered to across a code base in a consistent way, which is not about just code generation, but like abstractions and how do you follow them. And you see real engineers with real humans fall out of sync with that. They're like, hear one engineer complain about another team, we put an abstraction in place and they're not using it right and we're not following it. And you're like, then it becomes code debt. And then, you need to clean that up. And I think when I hear folks talk about what is the future of this and you're replacing engineers, I've heard some management consultants at the like very largest firms that people would know and say, the question that comes out of them, it's almost too perfect to be the trope, is, so how many engineers less can we have on our clients? And I'm like, it's just not there yet today. And I'm not sure that will be true. I think you'll get more and faster. And I don't think it's going to be less. Sorry to break it to you. I know there's many people that disagree with me wholeheartedly. They're like, no, engineers are going to be replaced. And I'm like,
No way.
I think engineers will be able to not focus on some parts of the work and focus more time in other parts of the work is really what's going to happen.
That's right. It will improve the technology, not by eliminating the person. I mean, that would certainly be what the trend I see. It will improve the ability of the people to do more sophisticated tasks, right? This is the classic, we're just, to use our own company's name, up-leveling the task all the time.
Yeah.
So you hopefully take away some remedial and add some more sophisticated, and the AI makes the sophisticated more palatable, but it's not just full replacing the person. That's silly. The approach there would be, we're not doing basic things. So if all your company ever does is ship whatever, a calculator app or something, maybe that's going to go away. But if you want to do something more sophisticated, it's not.
Yeah. Because someone was absolutely saying, when we invented languages and we stopped coding in assembly, we're so much more efficient. What are these other people going to do, right?
Yeah.
You see where that's taken us, right?
That's a great closer. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Steve, I want to be respectful of your time. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure. We'll make sure to link. I know you do some blog posts on your LinkedIn and various things, so we'll make sure to link to that in the following story here. But it was just a pleasure talking to you and look forward to seeing what predictions you just made come true. And for anyone who has any questions, we'll link so they can reach back out.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Have a good one.